Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are around the world. My name is Michel Goldman. I'm the co-director, together with Mathias DEWATRIPONT, of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare, I3h, of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. Thank you for joining us to follow this conference debate, which is organized as part of our interdisciplinary education program supported by the I3h Fund, a program that gathers students from different backgrounds, biomedical sciences, bioengineering, and public health, but also economics and other social sciences. What they have in common is obviously a keen interest in health. In these disrupting and uncertain times, there is still one certainty. We need to engage the young generation to defeat COVID-19. So this conference debate was primarily organized for them, but also for all of you who are wondering how we will come out of this crisis. Before giving the floor to Vanessa Costanzo, who will be our moderator, I would like to express my warmest thanks to the Delaine Private Bank, which is our unique partner for this conference. And of course, to our guest speakers who accepted to join us in these exceptional circumstances. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michel, and good evening and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will have 7 scientists and economists joining us. You can see them. They are in 5 different countries. So that is the new way to hold conferences. And they will share their expertise and their guidelines. As you can see in the bottom of your screen, you can interact with our speakers. Didier Reynders, Commissioner for Justice, is also going to join us during this conference. Just one little precision. We are not here to criticize governments. We are not here to criticize political decisions. We are just here to take a step further. So speaker won't take any questions on this topic. As you know, 2 weeks ago, we held the first conference online, and a lot has happened since then. Yesterday, the European Commission has issued a joint roadmap statement and to lift COVID-19 containment measures. So is it enough to move from declaration to action? What will be the place for collective intelligence? Which tools should be used? That is precisely what we are going to focus on today. And we will start with Alain FISCHER. Alain FISCHER, you are in Paris. You are an immunologist and holder of the chair of experimental medicine at the Collège de France. You have seen, I know, the joint roadmap. Is this the plan you were expecting for, you were hoping for?
Hello, everyone. First of all, I was very pleased to read it. So that there is a document. This is a good start. And also, it's a good point that this document recognizes the primary role of the scientific expertise in preparing decisions. And the fact that the EC presidency is associated with a top-level expert group is also a good sign. I was also pleased to read a plea for solidarity and open-mindedness between state members in order to coordinate, for instance, the lockdown exit, and perhaps hopefully also to provide economical support for those who need it. So there's a mix of recommendation to member states and EC action. So there are a few points I'd like to briefly mention that are in the document, but to me, there is a need to be stronger in impulsion, perhaps sometimes funding and coordination. For instance, I'm talking about science preparing decisions like the development of databases. They are mentioned, but we need to have very strong clinical databases with strong epidemiology at the European level. The same about viral epidemiology, potential evolution of the virus. Obviously, there is a need to better coordinate and support therapeutic trials. There are multiple trials going on everywhere, but up to now, no therapeutics has been found. And I think Europe has a very important, is in a very important position to try to better develop these trials. Of course, the vaccination effort needs to be coordinated, to be pushed. I would also add the validation and the development of diagnostic tests, and perhaps also a dimension in human sciences that I didn't find, I have to say, in the roadmap statement about, I think Europe can do the job in terms of assessing the different policies of the member states, assessing the different public attitude, and this will be also very useful. And finally, I'd like to mention that there is, let's hope there will be drugs and vaccines in the near future to treat the patients with COVID-19. And I think Europe has an important role, although not Europe alone, but Europe has an important role to make sure that the prices of drugs and vaccines that are going to be developed are low enough so that everyone will have access to these drugs and vaccines, of course, obviously within the European community, but also abroad in the world.
Thank you, Alain. Mathias DEWATRIPONT, you are in Brussels. You teach economics at the ULB in Brussels. You have been the vice governor of the Belgian National Bank, and you are also the co-director of I3h. And recently, I think citizens here know about that, you have been recruited by the Belgian government to join the team of experts working on the lockdown exit strategy, so advising the government. Just to make it clear, because I don't want you to have any problem, I will mention the fact that you are not here to talk about what you are doing with the government. You won't reveal any secret. This is the responsibility of our Prime Minister, Sophie Wilmès, of course. So Mathias, you have recently published a paper in Nature, and it was a paper written with several Belgian signatories, including Michel Goldman. This was the first European paper advising a framework, a real framework for a progressive strategy for lockdown exit. Let's focus first on economics with you. This strategy will help restore economic activity, and also it will help protect from other casualties. Could you explain this to us?
Yes, so thank you, Vanessa. And in fact, the paper was published 2 days ago, but was submitted before I was asked to join this group, so it's not connected. Indeed, we are together with Michel and other colleagues. We are devising a broad strategy, and of course, the devil can be the details. But the broad strategy, which includes a number of elements which I think are reasonably non-controversial these days. First, wait past the peak and plateau of the epidemic, so as to have enough spare capacity in the healthcare services for a potential rebound of the epidemic. Second, before you start deconfining gradually, do a lot to improve both the protection equipment supply and testing capacity, both the RT-PCR tests and the serological tests, so both to see whether people are infected and whether they are past infection but immunized for important and dangerous jobs. Then next to that, do maintain the social distancing, the protection of people, masks and so on, and the tracing capacity, because I think countries like Germany, South Korea have shown that this is very important. And then once all this is ready, go gradual. Clearly, seniors should be protected longer and remain confined longer because they are most at risk. Go with workers first. And for workers, I think it's easier business to business than business to customers, because there you have a lot more people that interact. Schools is a question that has to be discussed, and there are different views on this, about the fact that on the one hand, it's more difficult to enforce social distancing for young children, but on the other hand, young children are less at risk. On the other hand, young children, they interact with parents. So these things are more complicated. But that's the broad lines of this paper in Nature Medicine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Carol Proper, hello. You are a professor of economics. You are in London, and so you are a teacher at the Imperial Business School in London. So you recently published a paper focusing on the impact that a recession could have on long-term health, more specifically also on chronic health.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. Yes, I think often people forget that recessions obviously affect economic activity, but they also affect people's health as well. And we did some work where we actually looked at the impact of recessions on chronic health. That's things like coronary artery disease, heart disease, diabetes, mental health problems. And what we looked at was the period that included the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And what we found is that recessions, we took Britain as our case studies, recessions have a big impact on people's long-term chronic health. And the size of the impact can be quite large. We estimated that a recession of the size of the financial crisis, which is probably much smaller than we have now, would lead to about a 20% increase in the incidence of some chronic health. Furthermore, that incidence didn't occur immediately, but would play out over a number of 2 or 3 years, which means that the implications for the health service and the capacity that Mathias referred to are that the health services of our countries will need a lot of capacity to deal with this sharp increase in chronic health that we foresee happening after the end of the economic crisis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carol. Michel Goldman, the framework you, Mathias DEWATRIPONT, and other Belgian researchers have built rely on the implementation of diagnostic capacity. So we see today how difficult it can be, and it is at the moment actually, to get enough detection tests in our countries. According to the joint European roadmap, can we say that we are today ready to put an order on the other kind of tests, so serological tests?
Yeah, so let me explain that scientifically we are ready. The science is there. We know the antigens that we have to use as target to measure our antibodies. The point is that we have to scale up the production of those tests. We have to decide which type of test. It's a bit technique, but there are tests which require usual blood sampling. Other people argue that just fingerprint tests could be used as well. So there is a debate around this. But the main question is really scale up production. Obviously, another main question is to validate, to certify the fiability of these tests. But I think that really the main challenge is to scale up the production. And you have to know that nowadays there are probably more than 70 companies around the world, usually small, medium-sized companies producing those tests. And the problem is that even if those tests are validated, their production will be a challenge. So we argue that there is a real need to reflect now how indeed mobilize the capacity and the capacity building to make sure that enough tests are produced. And also I think it's the role of Europe to already anticipate how these tests will be distributed across our countries. Right now, there is competition between the companies and also competition between the countries to attract tests. And I think that this should be a matter of discussion, negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Michel Kazachkin, you are based in Geneva. You have been working as the executive director of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria for many years. So basically, we can say that you know what a pandemic can be. Tests are supposed to assess herd immunity. We hear a lot about that. And this herd immunity is considered like a collective defense against the virus. Isn't it too early to base a lockdown exit strategy on it?
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for the question. And it follows what Michel Goldman just said. Herd immunity is really immunity within the population. Basically, the percent of people in a given population that has antibodies, which means people who have been in contact with the virus, and hopefully and presumably people who are protected from infection. It's believed that in order for a population to be protected against a pathogen, herd immunity should be at least around 60%. Now, here are the issues we have now with this. First, although we haven't many surveys, but the first surveys we have in Europe and some of the mathematical modeling show that immunity at this time would be somewhere around 10%, between 5 and 15% of the population. So we're not in a context where we have herd immunity and protection. This means that we need to continue measuring this as we progress in the next months, but this means that we have to focus our lockdown exit strategies, as was said by Matthias and others, on detecting the people who are infected with virological tests and confining these people, tracing their contacts and confining these contacts. And then we have a few issues. Michel Goldman spoke about the production, the mass production, the scale up in tests that we need. We also need to make sure that the tests measure protection. It's not yet a yes and no answer. That is, if you are antibody positive, you are protected. We still have some scientific unknown there. Maybe you need a certain titer, a certain amount of antibody in order to be protected. And then, of course, we need tests that are easy to use. And that's something I saw with malaria and other diseases across the world. You need what we call bedside tests that everyone can use. So I hope our collective intelligence can solve these problems soon.
Thank you. Michel Goldman, you want to add something? We cannot hear you, Michel.
Just a short comment. Recent data clearly indicate that some people, we don't know the proportion, which have been infected, which are either asymptomatic or post-symptomatic, few symptoms, actually do not develop antibodies. And that's something quite important, also referring to, the herd immunity. So it's not granted that because you was in contact with the virus that you develop the antibodies. And that's something which probably will make the lockdown exit strategy even more complicated.
So, Michel, just to ask one more question to you, since you said that this person will only get an immunity through a vaccine, that's the only solution for them?
That's a possibility, but we know as immunologists that inflammation, so I would say that the disease, it goes indeed inflammation, and inflammation is necessary to induce the immune response. Actually, in vaccine, you have the so-called adjuvant, and what the adjuvant is doing is providing those so-called inflammatory signals which allow the immune system to answer. And it might be that in some people, the virus is well tolerated, doesn't induce inflammation, and induce either low or even no response. We still don't know, but recent data, mostly from China, suggest that indeed this might be the case in a certain proportion of individuals.
It would be a small proportion of individuals, Michel? You don't know. Okay. Elke Nowotny, thank you for joining us. You are in Vienna. You are a social scientist studying science, technology, and innovation. You have chaired the ERC, so the European Research Council, from 2010 to 2013. as we know, deconfinement will be progressive, that's for sure. It means also that we will have to be involved very deeply, and also we will be in charge of it.
We see something quite remarkable now that many of us thought not possible just a few years ago, namely the trust in science. Remember, we were all engaged in organizing the marches for science. There was a wave of populism, distrusting experts, and so on. And what we see now is that trust in science is there. But we also need trust in governments. If you want to take the population with you in whatever measures, science-based, evidence-based measures are recommended and have to be taken, you need trust in governments. So how can you achieve this? Trust is something that builds up over time, but at least from the point of view of communication, there are some rules. Communication has to be clear. If possible, it has to come from a source that is regarded as credible. And the message has to be repeated. Saying it just once will not sink in. So you have to repeat the same clear message for people to engage in it. You have to explain why, but you don't have to go into many details. And again, this is part of the way how you create trust. And science gives us a lot of answers, even there's much that is not known. I think we know pretty clearly what needs to be done to take the population with us. But there must also be some timeline involved in the communication. If you tell people, you know, we don't know, this will go on for years and years, you will just get the opposite of what you want to achieve. So you have to be very careful in not over-promising anything, but still give people the confidence you are working on it. Governments, scientists are certainly working on it. Governments listen to scientists, and then we will get there. So collective intelligence is not just us. We need also the collective intelligence of the population.
Mm-hmm. Helga, one question about what you said. You said, obviously, we have to repeat the message. So the government will have to repeat the message. But isn't it difficult when we are in a world with social networks, with a lot of information, also coming from traditional media, traditional press? Repeating the same message in one country is easy, but at the same time, we have information coming from other countries around us. And isn't it confusing for people to say, yes, for example, in France, we can do that, but in Belgium, it will be different. In France, school will get opened again, they will reopen, and in Belgium, they will stay closed. So how is it possible to take care of the people and to have them involved, deeply involved, since they have different messages?
You know, I think people are not, they are not stupid. And what we saw is the virus spreads in a temporal sequence. We know it started basically in Lombardy. So not all of Italy was initially affected, started in Bergamo, in Lombardy. Then eventually it was also reaching other parts of Italy. We know it was transported from there to Tyrol because people went skiing. From there, it went even to Norway and Iceland because people were skiing there. And we can clearly see that in some countries, we are already on the exit road. For instance, in Austria, the small shops are allowed to reopen. Public transport has been working all the time, but now people wear face masks when using public transport. So you can see country by country is affected at a different time. And this you can also explain to people.
We'll join Philippe AGHION in Paris. Hello, Philippe. You are a professor of economics at the Collège de France, holder of the chair of economics of institution, innovation and growth. We know that the main difficulty from the beginning of this crisis has been the lack of supply regarding protective masks and regarding tests also. You already said that. You published a paper last week to explain it. So how can you explain disparity between European countries? And I think we lost Philippe. Okay, we'll continue among us, and we go back to Mathias, maybe another economist. So Mathias, you are part of the team of experts advising the Belgian government, as we said, and we just talked with Helga Novotny about the fact that we have several countries, but is it also the same for a government when you have to take decisions for your own country, for your own population, who's waiting for you to do something? Is it easy also to take care of the opinion of the European Union? Where do you have to go? To slow down, just to wait for the Europe, or to go ahead and then to see what happened?
Well, I think, Vanessa, I mean, this question about what should Europe do, what should member states do, what should regions do, is of course a question that has been with us since the beginning of the European Union or European Community or whatever. Of course, Europe is very important. We know that thanks to Europe, in the last 75 years, we haven't had a war between European Union countries. And I think that's in the previous 75 years, we've had 3 just between Germany and France. So this should never be forgotten. On the other hand, it's not because Europe exists that it should do everything. There is also this subsidiarity principle. Now, Helga said that in here, one thing which is important is that the epidemic hasn't reached member states at the same time, and therefore they are at different moment of the epidemic curve, and therefore it's natural that those, given that confinement is socially and economically costly, it's normal that some are trying to get out of confinement before others. So, and that has to do with the local evolution of the health parameters. On the other hand, it's also true that Europe has a role to play, and as the 2 Michels already have said, in particular, Europe should lead where it makes sense that Europe should lead, and in particular on the whole issue of industrial policy, vaccines, testing, all these kinds of things. It is important that Europe is forceful enough to make sure, just like we need a European science policy, we need a European industrial policy in these essential sectors that should remain competition friendly, but that should, especially in times of urgency, where centralization is needed, we need Europe to lead.
So Mathias, you said what I had to say, so I can just pass my turn. Oui, c'est ça, c'est ce que je devais dire, donc je passe mon tour.
Non.
C'est plus facile pour moi, voilà, easier for me.
Philippe, I have something to ask you.
No, I don't have anything to add. It was extremely well said.
No, but we want to hear. No. We want to hear.
It's no problem at all. I enjoy consuming.
No, I want you to talk about your paper. Last week, you issued a paper talking about the lack of supply, and you actually found a reason why the situation is so diverse from one country to another, and specifically your study was focusing on France and Germany.
So first, you have not introduced who I am, Madame. No, that's fine.
Yes, I told it, but you were not there, so I wasn't
there. Okay, thank you. So because it was blocked, system. 1 second, let me share with you. 1 second. Okay, do you see the figure? Does it show?
Yes.
Yes, fine.
Okay. So just one figure. France, Germany, 80 million people live there. 3,200 dead from COVID so far. France, 60 million inhabitants, more than 15,000 dead from COVID. So there is quite a dramatic contrast between France and Germany. And there may be many sources, many explanations, but clearly France was suffering from a dramatic shortage of masks, tests, and respirators. And that's why that prompted us with a team of economists to look at the comparison between France and Germany in the imports and exports of COVID-related products, tests, respirators, gloves and masks, all the components that are used in fighting, in the COVID fight. And what's very interesting is that in 2019, which is here, Germany has a trade surplus of 20 billion euros, whereas France has essentially no surplus. You see, the blue is the export and the red is the import. There is almost no difference between export and import in France, and the big difference, Germany exports much more than it imports. And in fact, Germany imports a lot to France, actually. We depend a lot on Germany, which is and you see also that Germany is much higher than France. But what's also very interesting is that if you go back to 2002, we were almost equal. So there's been, you see, an increasing gap between France and Germany. And so that, the question is, why is Germany has been much more active in the imports and exports of these products on the COVID component than we have been? And so that question, the notion of value chains, I believe that Germany has a better control on the production part of its value chains than France has. So it may be due to various factors. We have to think about it. Certainly, Germany has invested much more than France in research and innovation. Germany also has invested a lot in what we call semi-skilled labor, which is also very important. The organization of school with firms is different in Germany and France, and there is more industrial policy in Germany than in France. And so that calls for a response to the COVID, which is not just a demand-side response. We need to address the demand side to boost consumption, but we also need to address the supply side, and in particular, what Mathias was saying about industrial policy, rethinking industrial policy, not just at the French level, at the national level, but at the European level. By the way, incidentally, I think whenever France tries to explain that you should have Corona bonds to Germany, it's a dead end. But when you tell Germany we should have joint projects and joint investment, it's much easier. And I think it's a good approach to mutualize things through the investment and industrial channel than to mutualize as debts. And I think that may be something we may discuss later. I think I went beyond my 2 minutes. So, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. To go further, I would like to go back to Michel Kazachkin. Michel, like most of our speakers, you addressed manifesto to the EU institution. You had 100 signatories almost who joined the initiative. So scientists, economists coming from everywhere around Europe. What are you asking for was to mobilize collective intelligence. So what do you mean by collective intelligence?
So thank you. It's fairly simple. The starting point is that Europe has a remarkable research capacity. It has remarkable public health schools. It has remarkable economists and universities. And as Helga said before, I believe it has an enlightened citizenship that can fully understand the issue, can have appropriations of the issue, and in the current crisis climate, trust in the science. So our call basically is that comes from the community of scientists, but it's a call to the politicians and to the citizens that we all mobilize together behind and with the science as a collective intelligence with one objective: defeat COVID-19 in Europe and defeat COVID-19 globally. With regard to Europe, it doesn't mean that we won't or look for harmonized policies everywhere, as Mathias said before. However, there are issues which we've been discussing since the beginning of this afternoon, the tests, the development of vaccines, the human sciences, that we're obviously pooling the efforts together, pulling our collective intelligence together should help us provide a much stronger response to the virus.
But at the same time, may I ask you a question? We have, so scientists telling us that we have to share collective intelligence, but we also have pharmaceutical companies willing to improve their own vaccines and their own medicines, with medicines, which is totally normal. How can we handle this?
We handle that through building partnerships. And if I look at the previous epidemics, SARS, Ebola, or AIDS, which is the one I know the best, I think the world has shown that in facing a crisis, it can come together by building what we call public-private partnerships and alliances. And as we speak, there are lots of discussions everywhere in the world, particularly in Geneva, which is very much the world capital of global health, about which alliances should be formed. There's one that is very much discussed these days around vaccines, which is called COVAX, an alliance with many of the industrial and public health organizations around vaccines. But I'm sure there is competitions. There are huge issues between intellectual properties, but in times of crisis, the world has learned how to overcome that. So I remain fairly optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Michel Goldman, that is a topic that you very well know, since you have been the director of the IMI, the Innovative Medicine Initiative. What would you add to what Michel Kazakskin just said?
No, I would just say that indeed public-private partnerships are essential, that we have really wonderful industries, we have wonderful universities. The problem is to align their interest in the common good interest, I would say. This is indeed what IMI is trying to do. We have spent about 5 billion euros so far in this initiative, a number of projects against other epidemic diseases such as Ebola. But I think that in this case, we have to go one step further. We have really to make IMI much fit for purpose, which is to align better the public health interest and the industry interest. That's not easy. And for this, it's very important to make IMI more autonomous than it is so far. Actually, this is foreseen in the Council regulation, which create IMI. I think that we have really to make this so-called autonomy more concrete.
We will go further to this discussion, because I think it will be important also that we see what are the possibilities in Europe to organize the European leadership. But before that, I would like to read you one of the questions we got from one of our viewers. And the question is, how do we balance the need to reinitiate economy partly responsible for pandemic? That's their words, and to protect our health. I think that is for Mathias DEWATRIPONT, maybe?
My apologies, Vanessa.
You were not listening. I will repeat it. How do we balance the need to reinitiate economy and to protect our health?
Okay, thank you. And sorry, multitasking.
No, don't be.
So I think, well, on the one hand, economists are often criticized for putting the economy ahead of health, and so I think I can understand that. Of course, this can be a problem. This being said, as Carol explained very well, a recession can be quite detrimental to the health of some parts of the population. Even though, by the way, there is also evidence. There was a recent article by Angus Deaton and Anne Case explaining that life expectancy increases during recessions, partly because pollution goes down and traffic accidents and industrial accidents go down. But you know, in any case, it's not a good idea to just add deaths because these things are very can have very different psychological impact. You know, suicide versus cancer versus accidents. I think we cannot compare them. I think the important thing is to say that, let's face it, there can be consequences on the health sector of big recessions. There is economic hardship, psychological hardship, and so on. Confinement is not fun for a big chunk of the population. So I think the idea is, and that's of course the difficulty, we have to make sure that we don't deconfine quickly, because we have a given capacity for healthcare sector, and we know that if we go beyond that capacity, number of deaths can be multiplied by 5 to 10. So that's a big no-no. We have to be careful. On the other hand, we also don't want to unnecessarily delay the deconfinement, because that will mean problems, both economic and social problems, psychological problems. So in that sense, I think it's a very different balancing act. A new disease at some level, even though it's COVID of 2019. So it's not a completely new disease, but it is a pretty new, and there are lots of things we don't know yet. But we have to be very careful in balancing these things. And it's all about our collective health, physical and mental.
Thank you. We will take a step back, I would say, and go back to the question of the tests. We have seen how serological tests will be key in this lockdown exit. In addition, another tool, another mean can help avoiding massive contamination, and it is technology, smartphones, and more specifically contact tracing. As I told you, the EU Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, is with us for a few minutes. Thank you so much, Didier Reynders, for joining us. We know that you are very busy. Today, you will issue guidance to ensure data protection and privacy while using this kind of apps on smartphones.
Yes, thank you for such an opportunity maybe to explain, because we will publish such a guidance this afternoon, so it will be quite very fresh. But we have already published a recommendation in good collaboration with some colleagues like Thierry Breton. We have tried to organize a common toolbox at the European level. Of course, we will have different kind of apps in different member states, but we need to work on the same kind of system with interoperability between the different apps, because if you are with different kind of situation in different member states, of course, we need to work also cross-border, and we need to protect the different apps with huge effort on cybersecurity, to give two examples. But so there we are working on the same toolbox at the European level to have a pan-European approach. But now we will also publish, I said, a guidance about the compliance with the GDPR, so the data protection. It's very important that we have a capacity to organize a real protection for the privacy and for very sensitive data relating to health. So we try to work on it, and the publication will be very important because that will fix some limits. We have asked to the European Data Protection Board at the European level and the network of national authorities to take part in the process. And the first element must be that it's very important that the individuals remain responsible for their own data. So it must be a voluntary system on the decision taken by the different individuals to put on their smartphone a new app able to help in the fight against the pandemic, and maybe to communicate, through Bluetooth, the fact that when infected people was in touch with others, in contact with others during the last 12 days. And we need to limit also the storage of the data and to minimize so the number of the data used in such a process. And of course, it's for the time of the crisis, not for a longer period of time.
What would you call the time of the crisis? Because since now we don't know when the end of this crisis will be. So what would you answer to people telling you, yes, I will sign up and I don't even know for how long? Will it be like 6 months or for a year, for example?
No, first of all, it's possible to use that during the actual situation. The decision was taken by many member states to ask the people to stay at home, but except for some professionals, of course, in different sectors. But then when we will have an exit plan, an exit strategy, and you know that the Commission has published a sort of paper to organize the coordination of the exit strategy. During the exit strategy, it will be very important, I'm sure that you have said that, to test more and more people, but also to use such a kind of apps. And during what kind of period of time? I'm quite sure, I don't want to fix a term, but it will be till the arrival of the vaccine, because it's only the vaccine will be the real solution. But it's on voluntary basis, so it's possible at any moment to go out. If you are not sure that it's needed to continue, you may stop. But the most important element is to give trust, to give confidence to the users. Because if we don't have that, you know that there are many discussions about many decisions taken by one of another government. But here we are in the field of the data protection, of the privacy. If you then don't have trust in the possible use by the authorities, and the health authority first, of your data, you will have some hesitations to take part in the process. So we need to be transparent, and we need to explain that it's a decision of all individuals to take part and maybe one day to go out. But again, it's true, it will be long. When I'm speaking about the crisis, it's not just the period of when it's needed to stay at home, it's also during the exit strategy and maybe longer than that. So in my mind, till the end of the year at least, it will be useful to work with such a kind of apps. And to be able to do that in such a long period of time, again, we need to give trust. And it's the reason why we will publish this afternoon such a guidance, to be sure that there is a real control on the data protection. To be very concrete, we have decided to fight against the pandemic. But in Europe, it was possible to enter in the pandemic with a democracy. And we need to go out of the pandemic with also a democratic system. It's the reason why we are monitoring all the emergency measures, because we are afraid about some use of emergency measures in some member states like Hungary or Poland, with a real possible breach of the rule of law. But also we are very concerned to maintain the high level of data protection. The GDPR is maybe the only one system in the world with a so high level of protection. But there are some exceptions, public interest and certainly health. And here we need to manage the way to use the possible exceptions in the GDPR, but with a full trust of the citizens. And it will be with the testing, maybe one of the most important elements in the exit strategy.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question for you. We have discussed the roadmap released yesterday by the EU. I guess you have heard some criticism around you, saying that the EU was kind of too slow on it. Brexit was a blow to Europe, we can say. Isn't the COVID-19 crisis affecting Europe even more? What do you think?
But first of all, we need to repeat all the time that health, it's a national competence. And that's a real problem. So we have tried from the beginning to be very quick on the fight against the pandemic. First of all, on the budgetary side, we have decided the escape clause, so-called escape clause, so we have given a room for maneuver to all the member states. There are no limits in the use of the budget for this year. And we have said we don't want to start procedure about a huge deficit or huge debts. It's normal that there's a real capacity to move for the member states on budgetary side. We have given a very high level of flexibility for state aid in the same way. You may help different kind of actors. It's also possible for the Commission to put 100 billion euros on the table for the workers without any activity for the moment. You know that there are specific systems in some member states, but we have put an additional system to sustain all the member states and not only those where it was possible to have such a system. But about health, we try to organize a coordination and to be very open. Of course, we have published this week an exit strategy, but it was ready since 1 week. And you know that there are many hesitations in many member states to speak about the exit strategy before the end of the peak of the pandemic. But we have said, no, we need to publish that. We need to try to organize a good coordination. Of course, it will be in the hands of the member states to decide when and how it's possible to go back to schools, to go back to different kind of economic sectors. But at the European level, we try to explain that it's needed to have a coordination. The virus has no border, and it's impossible for one country or one member state region to go out of the crisis alone. But of course, it's very difficult because there are many sensitivities. I've heard to some head of states or to some prime ministers saying, yes, we will organize by ourselves the situation in our own country, of course. And it's said by the Commission also yesterday, you need to analyze on the ground the situation, but please, with a level of coordination among the member states. And one of the concerns is to have a good functioning of the internal market. Of course, it's possible to have some restrictions for the movement of people. There's a situation now that we have. But for the goods, it's very important to continue to organize transportation of goods. To give an example, if you want to have masks and testing in all the member states, it's very important, then it's possible to transport those masks and those equipment for the testing everywhere in Europe. So we try to organize such a coordination. But again, it's difficult to play a role with a real coordination when there are some member states thinking that they need to work alone. So it's maybe a real test for Europe, it's true. I'm hoping that after the crisis, it was possible to reinforce the competence of the European Union, also in the health sector. You have spoke about, I'm sure, testing and about maybe the mask also in the future, but why not a rescue capacity in the future at the European level? Is it not needed to have some storage of medical equipment at the European level and not in all the member states in the same kind of capacity? About the Brexit, of course, it's a difficult issue. It's a pity because I regret the Brexit, but it's a full decision of Great Britain. But I must say that, first of all, Michel Barnier is in better form for the moment because we know that he announced he was infected, but now is again at work. And we have had a new discussion with our British colleagues. So we try to have a smooth process with the British colleagues because it's better to both sides to find a way to have a good agreement for the future. But it's a long process and it will be till the end of the year, maybe. But that just doesn't affect the situation with the fight against the pandemic. But again, we try to organize a good coordination. And I'm sure that about the use of smartphone and apps or the use of testing, it's very important that we have such a coordination at the European level. We will have, if we restart, more and more cross-border activities. So if you test the citizen in one member state, but not in another one, or if you are using apps in one member state, but not in another one, you will have the same problem than we have had maybe in the first dissemination of the virus.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
My pleasure.
Venders, for being with us. I know you have to go, but thank you so much for taking the time. Goodbye.
And see you another time. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Helga de Rotny, I'm actually coming to you since this question is related to your field. Do you think that Europeans are ready for this kind of applications? Won't they be scared, though we have rules, but we know how scared people can be when it goes to when it comes to their own data and their privacy here in Europe. So won't they be scared, for example, that insurance companies can buy all this data?
So first of all, let me show you. This is my phone, and I have such an app on my phone. But in order for it to be effective, it needs 60% of the population to do the same. The app has to be coordinated with other apps in Europe, because otherwise, you know, I may meet one of you physically, and if the app is only valid for Austria, it's no use. So the challenge before us is to get 60% of European citizens to voluntarily adopt such an app. Now, paradoxically, we have been told, and the Commissioner just mentioned it, that between China on one hand and the US on the other hand, Europe has been a model in protection of data. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's true. So the paradox exists that now people say, well, you know, we have these very high standards and we are proud of it because we don't want to go the authoritarian way of China nor the Wild West of the US. So we are proud that we have these high standards, and you have to convince them not only to adopt it voluntarily, you have to convince them that it is precisely this app that meets the European high standards. And in order to do that, you have to involve, again, trust came up, what I said in the beginning, you have heard it again. We have to cultivate the kind of trust. Now, what has to happen is that in every country, you had some data protection activists. And they were part of the, you know, the whole movement to get to this high level, sorry, this high level of protection was driven partly by their activism. You have to involve them. Several of them have said in public, this is up to our standards. So you have to get to involve them and to ask them to be part of the campaign to explain to everyone, we have been instrumental in setting these high standards, and the apps that now exist are meeting these standards. Otherwise, you know, if you go below 60%, it will not fulfill the purpose.
Isn't it the first time that we ask people in Europe to accept such a control on their life?
That's
to protect someone else, but
no, that's absolutely true. But it's the first time in Europe that we have a pandemic, you know, that shuts us in our homes. We cannot go out, etc., etc. So people understand this. But I think you have also to make it very clear. It will not be over in 1 month, in 2 months. But we can learn to live with it if we take certain precautions. And I think to have such a tracing app is one of the precautionary measures. Just as, you know, keeping distance, stop hugging and kissing each other when we meet, and things of this kind. And people will understand this is part of a long-term strategy. Of course, and again, trust in governments is important. You have to have the trust in governments that once it is no longer necessary, you know, everything will be erased, etc. So we have to work with that. And just as I said before, you know, we have now regained the trust in science, but we also have to use these people who were activists in helping to set these high data protection standards, to involve them, and they have to go out and explain to people, do this, we have looked at the app, it meets our standards, it's safe, believe us, it's safe, and this has to happen in every European country.
Mm-hmm. I will go to Michel Goldman, who would like to add something.
What we are discussing here is probably the most important aspect, and it's such an important aspect which actually is missing in the roadmap that we got yesterday. You use the word the population has to accept. The point is that our citizens should understand that it's in their own interest. They should ask for it. You know, it's a question of citizen ownership of what we will do. And for this, obviously, as Helga said very well, we need education. at the end of the day, we have to make our citizens, I would say, pandemic savvy, so that being savvy, they will understand why they actually will ask for this type of tools or devices.
Carol Proper, you would like to add something, and actually you would like to make a point also on trust in science and GDPR issues.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on this discussion because I think, you know, as Helga said, we are now in a position where the public perhaps trusts the scientists. But we are not really in a position, I think, where either the public trusts the government or more generally that we know very much about the economic, the political and the social facts of what the COVID-19 is doing. We don't really understand how lockdown is affecting people. We don't understand how lockdown is affecting their political attitudes and their social attitudes. And for example, we don't know really who is affected by the economic lockdown. That matters. We know we all are, but exactly who? We do not know who is responding to public health measures to do social distancing and who, for example, will use an app. People we know are differentially affected by the economic consequences of the lockdown, and they're also differentially affected socially. And for this, we need not scientific facts and a belief in scientific facts. We need facts on individuals' consumption behavior, who they mix with, their patterns of mobility, whether they're going out, whether their income has fallen. And all of those within the European context have absolutely huge GDPR issues. We do have those data. People like the banking system have those data, but they are obviously bound by these very big confidentiality issues. We need to have a discussion with the population about lifting these so we really can understand who exactly is affected, who exactly will respond. I feel that public health measures are often just announced and it's believed that with good education, everyone will behave. Well, we know that's not the case. Maybe it is in some European countries, but it isn't in Britain. And it wasn't in Australia, for example, when they had huge numbers of people on Bondi Beach. So we need that kind of private information on people to become available to scientists, to become available to be analyzed so that we can understand the distributional impacts and make this very difficult decision between lockdown and moving out of lockdown.
Also, this kind of information, I was thinking, could be very helpful for plasma. Who would like to say a word for that? Because we know that plasma can be used or could be potentially used to cure people. Who would like to say a word about it? Michel? Michel Kazakhin?
There are several Michels here. At
yes.
least two, yes. And both of us are actually working
yes.
on this issue of plasma therapy. So we've been talking about antibodies and people who earlier, when we talked about tests, people who recover from COVID-19 generate these antibodies that are protective antibodies. And thus the obvious idea, and it's not a new idea, it's an idea that is 100 years old, is to use the plasma of people who are convalescent from COVID-19. So the plasma of people who have antibodies, to transfuse that plasma, administer that plasma to patients. And here we're thinking of patients who are the most severely ill in order to neutralize the virus in the body of these patients and hopefully help them recover better and faster. This is not the first time it's done in a viral disease. There are data indicating effectiveness of such plasma, convalescent plasma infusions in patients with diseases close to COVID-19, that is H5N1, the pandemic flu, and H1N1, another pandemic flu, and also Ebola and other instances. So there is now a big effort around the world to enter clinical trials and test really this hypothesis in severely ill patients. Michel, the other Michel Goldman and I are working hard to try and coordinate these efforts at the European level, because we've been talking about how policies may be different from one country to another. Unfortunately, at this time, many of the experimental clinical trials for drugs or for convalescent plasma, let's say, are also done nationally without any European coordination. And this is where our collective intelligence, again, could help.
Thank you for this transition, because I'd like to go further in these thoughts about, we talked about this so-called agency. You have a collective intelligence, but you need to have a place where you can mobilize it, and you need someone to decide what to do with this collective intelligence. So what agency or what institution could be the right one? For example, Philippe AGHION, according to you, which one should it be?
I think maybe I'm not qualified to answer, thanks very much, but I'm not qualified to answer this question. I think, you know, I know the ERC has been a big success in Europe. That's something that works very well. We need, so for what's basic research, we have the ERC, which is a great thing. We don't have the equivalent of ERC, as Mathias and Michel and others have said, for the transition from basic research to commercialization. Sometimes this transition involves coordinating big fixed costs that need to be coordinated. And there is, that's what we call tough technologies. Technologies where the basic research has been done, and you are not quite at the, you know, operationalization of the research. And because that stage requires coordinating large resources, different actors, and that's why that's what we call an S-curve, you see, and that's where the DARPA experience in the US has been interesting. Of course, DARPA was created by the Defense Department for the Cold War, and I very much dislike the Cold War, and I'm not at all, so I'm not here for defense and Cold War, okay? But the innovative aspect of DARPA, which I think can be used in other fields than defense. It's already used in energy, and it could be used in on health. So it's to coordinate bottom up and top down. So the idea of DARPA is that the defense ministry, or not the defense, but here would be the health ministry of the various countries, would put resources, and the resource, and you see, then they put in charge team leaders, and the team leaders have autonomy. So there is a top-down in the sense that they have a mandate. You see, say you should need to achieve that objective, like a vaccine in 12 months, or like, so the objective is well defined, but the way you achieve the objective, you have autonomy of the way you organize, but the funding comes directly from governments. So if we wanted to do that in Europe, my view was that it could be several countries in Europe, and hopefully all of them, would have their health ministries, their governments, contribute the funding of such an organization for health in particular. You see what I mean? So it would not necessarily be on the European budget. It would not be subject to veto vote, because you don't want that. All those in Europe who want to be part of it could be part of it. You see what I mean? Hopefully everybody. And it would be intergovernmental. And but it will have this mixture of top-down and bottom-up. Vanessa, you see what I mean? That's what makes it innovative. And you know, in the US, I mean, they achieved a lot of things with this governance. And Germany just created one, DARPA, for Germany. And I think we should do one with the European countries. I mean, that's just an idea to mobilize, to have a kind of new thinking on industrial policy. It's good to say we invest more, but it's good to have a good governance for this European industrial policy. And I thought that intergovernmental DARPA could be one way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. We'll see with Helga Novotny, for example, what you think about this point of view. We know you have been the president of the ERC, so the European Research Council. Do you agree with this point of view, or do you think that maybe the ERC could be the leader of it?
No, let the ERC do what it does well and best, and don't try to change the ERC. But we have now the European Innovation Council, which started on a 2-year trial basis, but under the new framework program, Horizon Europe, it is part of the new framework program. And we have been discussing DARPA for decades. You know, Europe needs a DARPA, etc. But then there are some good reasons why it's difficult to imitate the success where you have one big customer. DARPA has the big customer, which is the American military, with very deep pockets. So this is difficult, but we have the European Innovation Council. And I think there you have the possibility also, you have flexible instruments, and perhaps you can fine tune a little bit to go more in the direction of what we are discussing now. But the instrument is there. So instead of trying to set up something new, and especially how do you get governments now to put in money into a new fund, let's use what we have. And I think the European Innovation Council has been very carefully crafted after the ERC, in the sense that it's the principle of excellence in innovation.
Mm-hmm. Michel Goldman, EMI, European Innovative Council, what do you think?
I think that we have many instruments, many agencies, and I'm not sure that an additional one will solve the issue. I think it will be just another machin, we would say in French. I think what we need is to change the way the Commission interacts with these agencies and with our team. There is still too much bureaucracy. There is still too much red tape. The Commission is always afraid of what the European Court of Auditors might say about the way the money is spent. And it's my experience that, you know, you can give more autonomy to some of those agencies that were mentioned. So it's more the modus operandi of the agencies depending on the Commission than to create a new agency will not change anything. What we have to change is the way the Commission interact with the different bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Michel, that you wanted me to talk about the DARPA because you are very excited about it. And now I understand you want me to talk about it to just say that it's not a good idea.
This is like a big family here. It's just a...
No, but just to clarify, it's not a joke.
You should have told me this morning. I would have done something different.
But I
think... say it then. If you want to say something different, just say it, Philippe AGHION.
No problem. Yeah, okay.
No, I think that the important point is that the principle, it works. And the principle top down and the other direction, this doesn't work in current instruments. And my point is that I know the Commission a bit, and I think that even if you create a new thing, you might call it a DARPA-like, if you don't change the way the Commission interacts, even if we call it DARPA, it will not work. That was my point.
Okay.
We're fine? Everyone in peace? Okay, so take a step further. Helga, from a social perspective, we have been talking about tests and we have been talking about apps. There is something that we will have to say, is that actually some people will go back to life, to normal life. Some people will just stay home. Some others will have to wait a bit longer. Isn't it something that will create stigma between people?
I am not so much afraid of stigma because, you know, after all, we know we are in it together. But what I'm afraid of is that the present crisis is laying bare the amount of inequality we have in our societies. And it shows up when you call for social distancing. Now, there are people who have nice flats, you know, and you can drink champagne and read Ulysses or something. And the other people live in very crowded quarters. And if you let people work at home, first of all, not everyone can work at home. But even then, if you have children and working at home in crowded quarters where the children don't even have, you know, a corner where they can quietly do what they are supposed to do, namely to study what they will need in school. You know, these are all the inequalities that now come to the fore. And I think we have to address them. And I hear very little about that. People are aware of it. Of course, we know we live in unequal societies. But now it is hitting our societies and it's staring in our face. And I think we have always to ask whatever we do. And I think this was mentioned before already when we heard about, you know, the kind of data that we would need, and I fully agree. You know, it's affecting people in different ways, and it's affecting them according to lines that we know are the lines of inequality. Economic, social, you have it. It's all there, and this is something we need to address.
Mm-hmm. Carol Proper, I see you saying yes, and actually, I think if we go back to the problem we talked about with you, we can also make a difference from one person to another, or one social category, we would say. I don't like this word, but to another.
I mean, we know, you know, we have all these aggregate figures. We have a drop in the economy of 35% forecast for most European economies in the next quarter. Those are huge, but as Helga says, we know that these are not going to be borne equally. They're going to be borne by those who are vulnerable, those who are in poor mental health, those who have low attachments to the labor market. And all over Europe, we have young people who have very low attachments to the labor market. They're in poorly paid jobs, lack of training, and this is going to hit them particularly hard. And it hits them particularly hard at an age where they should be having opportunities. And I don't think we're acknowledging that. And I think that underlies whole issues around social unrest and other things that we really haven't begun to address, which are so important. And the other thing is, I think we'll see a lot of disparity across places. There are places where people are much less able to be resilient to these kind of crises, both the health crises and the economic crises. And I think we'll see what has been often called pockets of deaths of despair emerging, where there are places which are scarred for a long term from the impact of COVID, where there are other places that will be quite okay. And I think we need our policies, when we think about lockdown and we think about coordination and we think about roadmaps, we really need to be addressing the fact that we have very fundamental inequalities in our society. And as Helga says, these inequalities are going to be sharpened by COVID. Not only the disease, but the response of the lockdown and the economic shock from that.
Okay. Alain FISCHER, I'm back to you, because we have talked a lot about tests, but we also talked about coordination, European coordination. And what I see is that we still haven't found the right way now, or the right organism. People have a different point of view. So what will happen if we don't have such a coordination? Don't we risk facing criticism regarding the test? I mean, don't we risk to hearing that tests used in one country were less precise than the tests used in another country, for example?
This is a bit technical, but I think this is a critical question, because indeed we need to speak the common language. I mean, when we want to assess what is the number of the fraction of people who have been infected and are presumably protected, we have to use, again, the same language, that is the same technique that has been validated. And as mentioned earlier, I'm here talking about, of course, the serology test. There are many, something like 70, 80 different societies or biotechs that are developing their own tests. Some want the so-called rapid test and the more classic ELISA type assay. And it is likely that among these 80 different tests, let's say, not all of them will be validated. So we absolutely need to have a system of marking. And obviously Europe could be a good place to do it, to have everything as quickly as possible being tested. I know that such comparisons are being done, but today, for me at least, it's not clear where we are standing in terms of getting soon access to tests that we can share between us so that we have a clear appreciation of the level of protection of the population. We have to say this is not easy. Again, it was mentioned earlier, the quality of antibodies that are made, especially by those people who have been infected without symptoms, so the so-called asymptomatic people, they may not develop antibodies, or they may develop antibodies transiently, or they may develop antibodies that are not protective. So this is really a difficult issue, and it requires a common effort to get at the end, and obviously with the end that is not in a too long time to wait for, with tools that we can share again, so that we have the common view of what's going on and the common, potentially, the common tools to decide who should need to be tested, who should need to be put into quarantine, and so on and so on.
I think we would need a third debate, maybe. Michel Goldman, I'm launching the idea, but I think we will need it just to discuss that. But before we leave you and let you go back to your normal life, I would say, or your containment life, I would ask Elga Novotny to share maybe her feeling. I don't know if you already have studies about that, but we are just living something so different. I mean, this conference, it is such an example of it. We have been working all together in 5 separate countries. A lot of them even didn't know each other, and we have started working together and getting inside each other house. Just one of us is at the office. I can see Carol proper, but for the others, we are all home. So we are talking about sharing data, we are talking about accepting things that we never had accepted before, just because, and it is so important, we want to protect us and to protect our beloved ones, and also all the other citizens. Do you think, Elga Novotny, that this COVID crisis is going to change the way we used to live in and I'm not talking about social network, I'm not talking about the way you live generally, but will it affect the kind of path we were following till now?
I think definitely we are being pushed by the virus into the digital world. We know the digital world is there waiting for us, and now we get a big push. We will have more e-learning. Part of it will be blended learning, but definitely there's a push there. We will have more e-health, whatever it means and however it will look like. We will have more e-banking. Whatever you say will be more digitalized. On the other hand, I think there's a very important experience that we all have made during this 2 or 3 weeks of confinement now, that we still have bodies and we still want to be physically also together with other people. And I think this is the big challenge. How can we, make this step into the digital world? And it has many opportunities to offer to us. You described some of them, but at the same time, not to leave behind, what makes us human. And part of what makes us human is that we also need the kind of, to be socially together also with a physical bodily presence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elga. I would like to thank you all the speakers, for this incredible amount of work you have done during the past 2 weeks, because people do not see that. We have been sharing all this work with them for an hour and a half, but you can even not imagine how many nights, how many days you have been spending to launch all this, and also working with the manifesto. So I would like to thank you for having me with you, because this is an incredible experience for me. It is very important to see how you work and how you try to get things done to help citizens, because before everything, you remain doctors, scientists, economists, and that's what you want to do. So dear viewers, thank you so much for being with us this time, and your presence was a fantastic reward for each of us. Replay of this conference will be available in a few hours on I3h website. As you know, all this has been possible thanks to I3h sponsors, in this case, Dell Private Bank. If you want to follow I3h, and if you want to support also I3h independent work, please join us on I3h website and social medias. I would just tell you one more thing: please take care of yourself, take care of your relative, and we'll see you. We don't know when, but we'll see you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's nice being